Well, I actually got eye poked twice in the fight. First one wasn't too bad. He got warned for it. The second one, obviously, Rogan tried to make my head a bowling ball with the double eye poke, knuckle deep in both.
When you really break this down, only Tom holds the answers. Can he actually see properly now? Is his vision back to fighting level? Will he be able to compete at the highest level? These are questions that only he can answer truthfully.
Well, listen, I didn't continue. I'll tell you why I didn't continue. Because I'm not a dummy. Like, I'm not going to go out there and fight one of the best strikers in the world if I can't see.
With double vision.
With any eye. Look, I know, as an MMA fighter, look, things are going to happen in the fight that compromise you.
Here's where things stand according to Dana White's most recent statements. The UFC is actively working to reschedule the Aspinall versus Ciryl Gane matchup, but there's a major catch. This can only happen once Aspinall gets full medical clearance from his eye injury. The heavyweight champion is still dealing with serious vision problems, and doctors are discussing surgical options.
We put the doctors' reports out recently.
Yes.
Which has been a bit of a whirlwind, to be honest with you, because I know there's a lot of haters out there.
Let me walk you through everything we've learned about Dana White's latest position on the Tom Aspinall situation. What unfolded with that eye injury and what happened afterward represents one of the most controversial moments in recent UFC heavyweight history.
I got a double eye gouge, so it wasn't even like an eye poke, it was like an eye gouge. So both eyes, the left eye, my left eye, the left eye looked worse, but the right eye is the one that had the most damage.
This situation exploded into public view recently. Dana White just made an announcement that's sending ripples throughout the entire MMA world. Tom Aspinall is caught in the middle of a situation that could completely reshape how we remember his championship reign.
So they don't really know when I'm going to be back at the moment. I'm still not even clear to train or do anything. They're talking about doing surgery on both eyes. They're talking about injection. I have to get an injection in the eyeball soon.
Jeez.
So I'm not looking forward to that. So
the heavyweight title, which represents the pinnacle of combat sports achievement, has become the center of a heated debate involving the fighter who waited longer than almost anyone to finally claim it as his own.
How did that sit with you?
I was very disappointed. Yeah, very disappointed.
Do you think the way that was phrased led to some of the criticism afterwards? In other words, if he would have come up and said, poked in the eye, illegal, couldn't see, couldn't continue, serious injury, etc., people would have laid off. They would have taken cues from him.
Let's go back to what started all this chaos. October 25th, 2025 marked a date that should have been Tom Aspinall's crowning moment. The Eddie Hearn Arena in Abu Dhabi was set to host his first defense of the undisputed UFC heavyweight championship. His opponent was former interim champion Ciryl Gane.
Training again.
Look, it's not up to me. It's up to the doctors. At the minute, I ain't allowed to do nothing, so I'm just following advice at the moment.
What's next?
What's next for me right now is there's talk of surgery on the eyes. We've got to see how it goes over the next few weeks.
This represented Aspinall's 19th professional mixed martial arts bout. UFC 321 was supposed to be his showcase moment. More than 18,000 fans filled the arena, all expecting to witness an absolute war between two incredibly skilled heavyweight fighters.
Well, look, if you were sidelined from doing your job for like 15 months, not allowed to do anything, you train your off for 6 months for a fight, then to get double eye poked, to be left with no vision for nearly 6 weeks because of an illegal move, how do you think I feel? I'm not feeling fantastic, am I?
Everyone expected this to be Aspinall's moment of validation. This was his chance to silence anyone who still questioned whether he truly deserved to hold the championship without having defeated Jon Jones inside the octagon. After Jones retired in June 2025, Aspinall got promoted to undisputed champion status. Gane became his first major test. The betting odds heavily favored Aspinall at -350, while Gane came in as a significant underdog at +280. This fight was being sold as a striking masterclass waiting to happen. Aspinall had been demolishing opponents with lightning-fast knockouts in his previous title fights. Most people figured Gane would just become another highlight reel moment for the British powerhouse. Round 1 started exactly as expected. Aspinall came forward aggressively, throwing heavy leg kicks and sharp jabs. He landed a solid low kick that actually made Gane stumble for a second. Gane responded with some really crisp boxing combinations, including a sharp right hand and some effective body shots. He looked much sharper than a lot of people anticipated. Neither fighter took any serious damage in those early moments, but Aspinall was clearly controlling the center of the octagon. Both guys were still figuring each other out, finding their range and timing. You could feel the tension building in the arena, because everyone knew something spectacular was about to happen. Then, everything changed in an instant. The moment that would ultimately define this entire situation happened at exactly 4 minutes and 35 seconds into the first round. Aspinall threw another one of his signature low kicks. As he did that, Gane extended a jab that accidentally caught both of Aspinall's eyes with a deep, penetrating poke. Aspinall immediately crumpled to the canvas, grabbing his face, and clearly in tremendous pain. Referee Jason Herzog stopped the action right away, brought in the ringside doctor for an examination, and ultimately waved off the fight when Aspinall reported that his vision was completely blurred and he was experiencing severe pain. The crowd erupted in boos. They were frustrated and confused by the sudden stoppage. Officially, the fight got ruled a no contest due to an accidental double eye poke. Just like that, everything Aspinall had been working toward disappeared into controversy and medical uncertainty. What happened next was absolutely devastating for Aspinall. This wasn't just some minor inconvenience or a small scratch. The damage was so severe that Aspinall had to be taken directly to the hospital from the arena. Medical staff stretched him out and transported him immediately for emergency treatment. Gane was apologizing repeatedly, insisting the eye poke was completely unintentional. No fines were handed out, but the incident reignited all the old arguments about UFC glove design and how the promotion handles eye poke prevention. These debates had been brewing in the MMA community for years. But what Dana White said at the post-fight press conference created a crisis that's still playing out today. White stepped up to the microphone and delivered comments that would completely fracture his relationship with his heavyweight champion. White called the no contest result a major headache for the promotion. He claimed there was no significant damage to Aspinall's eye, most damaging of all. He framed the stoppage as Aspinall's personal choice, rather than a medical necessity. This created a narrative that would absolutely destroy Aspinall's reputation among certain fans. White's exact words were devastating. He said Gane had Tom bloodied up and Tom didn't want to continue in the fight. Those comments hit the fighting community like a bomb going off. The implication was crystal clear and incredibly damaging to Aspinall's reputation. Here was Tom Aspinall, the heavyweight champion, who had waited over 18 months for his shot at undisputed glory, and now he was being painted as someone who simply chose to quit when things got difficult. In a sport where mental toughness means everything, and fighters are expected to battle through any adversity, Dana White had essentially questioned whether Aspinall had the heart of a real champion. But nobody in that press room understood how serious Aspinall's injuries actually were. The medical reality was far more frightening than anyone realized at the time. Everything changed on November 30th, 2025, when Aspinall decided to go public with his official medical report on Instagram. This came after weeks of criticism from fans and Dana White's comments questioning how severe his condition really was. Aspinall wanted to prove once and for all why he couldn't continue fighting. The diagnosis was shocking. Aspinall was suffering from bilateral traumatic Brown syndrome, an incredibly rare condition caused by trauma to the eye's superior oblique tendon and trochlear complex. This condition is almost never seen in combat sports. It typically only occurs with severe orbital injuries, and having it affect both eyes simultaneously makes it even more unusual. Brown syndrome completely restricts vertical eye movement, causing severe misalignment and visual disruptions that make normal daily activities nearly impossible. Forget about professional fighting against elite opponents. Aspinall couldn't even function normally in everyday situations. Advanced medical imaging revealed orbital soft tissue trauma and a minimally displaced fracture of his right medial orbital wall. This was absolutely not something any fighter could power through with determination and willpower. This was a potentially career-ending injury that left one of the most dangerous heavyweights in the world unable to see clearly. Aspinall's symptoms were absolutely brutal. He was dealing with persistent double vision, severely restricted eye movement, blurred vision combined with extreme sensitivity to light, and substantial visual field loss. Doctors refused to medically clear him for any combat sports activity, and they were seriously discussing surgical intervention. Despite all this overwhelming medical evidence, Dana White maintained his original position. That's when the relationship between the UFC president and his heavyweight champion completely fell apart. The questions Aspinall started asking cut straight to the core of fighter safety in the UFC. Why should any professional fighter risk permanent damage to their vision because of an illegal action committed by their opponent? Why should the victim of a clear foul get painted as the villain for making the smart decision to protect their health and their career? These were questions that the UFC had never properly addressed or answered. On December 2nd, 2025, Aspinall appeared on the Ariel Helwani show and dropped a bombshell revelation. Dana White had not contacted him personally even once since the fight. 6 weeks had passed, and despite publicly speculating about Aspinall's health and character, White hadn't sent a single message. Aspinall confirmed that he has absolutely no relationship with Dana White anymore, and only deals with Hunter Campbell, the UFC's chief business officer. He hadn't received a single text message or direct message wishing him well. Not once in 6 weeks had the UFC president reached out. Aspinall did say that Hunter Campbell had been offering medical assistance and support, but that was the extent of what he was getting from the organization. The contrast between Campbell's attentiveness and White's complete silence spoke volumes about where Aspinall ranked in the UFC's priorities. Here's some important context. Between July 2024 and October 2025, Aspinall didn't fight at all because he was absolutely determined to face Jon Jones and kept refusing other fight offers. This brought the entire heavyweight division to a complete standstill. Now, with an indefinite recovery timeline, with serious talk of surgical procedures, with no clear date for when Aspinall could possibly return to action, Dana White was facing a decision that many people thought he would never make against one of his own champions. Championship belts represent much more than just hardware around someone's waist. They represent the marketability of entire divisions. They drive pay-per-view sales, sponsorship deals, and broadcasting rights negotiations. An inactive champion quickly becomes a financial liability rather than an asset, regardless of how they ended up inactive. Aspinall's hospital experience in Abu Dhabi was absolutely terrible. The facilities were completely overwhelmed when he arrived for emergency treatment. Aspinall later described waiting 3 or 4 hours in an emergency room that was packed with ordinary people dealing with minor injuries and intoxicated patients. By the time medical staff finally examined him, the doctor seemed to have very limited expertise in treating serious eye injuries. The entire experience was, in Aspinall's own words, a complete waste of valuable time. He didn't receive proper treatment until he returned home to the UK. Over the following weeks, Aspinall's life became consumed by medical appointments. He was visiting hospitals 2 or 3 times every week. Specialists examined his eyes from every possible angle, running countless scans and assessments to determine exactly how extensive the damage was. The final diagnosis was absolutely grim. Aspinall was definitively diagnosed with bilateral traumatic Brown syndrome. This extremely rare condition affects the muscles that control eye movements, specifically targeting the superior oblique muscle and tendon complex. The end result is severely restricted upward movement of the eyes, persistent double vision that never goes away, reduced motility throughout the entire visual system, and significant visual field loss that affects peripheral vision. In the most severe cases, this condition causes long-term complications that absolutely require surgical intervention to correct. What happened to Aspinall was not your typical eye poke that fighters sometimes deal with. Gaines' fingers had gouged deep into both of Aspinall's eyes simultaneously with tremendous force. The impact was sufficient to damage the delicate musculature surrounding both eyeballs. Aspinall became very insistent about calling it a double eye gouge rather than just a poke. That distinction was extremely important to him because it better described the severity of what actually occurred. In late November 2025, Aspinall made a decision that surprised a lot of people. He released his complete medical documentation to the public. The champion felt absolutely compelled to prove that his injury was completely real and legitimate. Social media had been incredibly cruel to him during this period. Critics were openly accusing him of quitting, faking his injuries, or massively exaggerating his condition for attention. Aspinall decided the only way to silence these people was with hard medical evidence that couldn't be disputed. During his interview on the Ariel Helwani show in early December, Aspinall addressed his critics directly. His frustration and anger were obvious from the very beginning of the conversation. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Aspinall at all. He had spent weeks going to hospitals, enduring countless tests and dealing with uncertainty about whether his vision would ever fully recover. Then he released comprehensive medical proof of his condition to the public. The response from some corners of the internet was that he was crying about it, being overly dramatic, milking the situation for sympathy, and going on a media tour just to get attention. Aspinall's frustration was completely understandable. He had done absolutely everything by the book. He fought when scheduled. He got fouled through no fault of his own. He stopped the fight because he literally could not see. He immediately sought proper medical treatment. He provided full documentation of his condition. And still, some fans were blaming him for the entire situation. When asked about the specific nature of his injury, Aspinall drew a very firm distinction between what happened to him and an ordinary eye poke. His description painted an extremely vivid picture of the damage he sustained. The double vision was the primary obstacle preventing his return to training and competition. Aspinall explained that he couldn't train properly because sudden changes in direction made him extremely dizzy and disoriented. The condition severely affected his depth perception and spatial awareness, which are absolutely critical attributes for any fighter who relies on precise timing and accuracy. The doctors discussed several different treatment options with Aspinall. None of them sounded pleasant or simple. The champion was potentially facing injections directly into his eyeballs and surgical procedures on one or possibly both eyes to correct the damage. This was the crucial context that Aspinall felt was completely missing when Dana White made his post-fight comments to the media. The champion had not quit on his stool. He had not chosen to stop fighting because things got difficult. He literally could not see what was happening around him. Continuing to fight against a world-class striker like Cyril Gane, while essentially blind, would have been incredibly dangerous and possibly career-ending. Aspinall made the only reasonable and responsible decision that was available to him under those circumstances. The mental and emotional toll was absolutely substantial. Aspinall had waited over a full year for this heavyweight title defense. He had watched John Jones receive preferential treatment from the UFC while he held the interim belt and waited for his opportunity. He had trained meticulously for Gane, studying endless hours of fight footage, preparing detailed game plans, and arriving in Abu Dhabi in absolutely peak physical condition. All of that dedicated work evaporated in a single moment because of a foul that he didn't commit and couldn't prevent. Now, instead of celebrating a successful title defense or analyzing what went wrong in a defeat, Aspinall was spending his time navigating hospital visits and defending his character and reputation. The complete injustice of the situation weighed heavily on him every single day. He was the victim of a clear foul, yet somehow he was the one facing the most criticism and scrutiny. The logic completely defied explanation, and yet there it was, playing out in real time across social media platforms and MMA discussion forums. The tension between Tom Aspinall and Dana White exploded into public view in late November and early December 2025. What started as subtle expressions of disappointment quickly evolved into an open disagreement about communication, perception, and basic respect. For the first time in his professional career, the heavyweight champion found himself in direct conflict with the most powerful person in all of mixed martial arts. Aspinall publicly expressed his disappointment in Dana White for making comments about his injury without bothering to speak with him directly. The problem was actually twofold. First, White had strongly implied that Aspinall chose not to continue fighting rather than being physically unable to do so safely. Second, White had not reached out personally, even once, since the fight occurred. For Aspinall, this felt like a complete betrayal of trust and loyalty. He had been a company man throughout his entire UFC career. He had accepted short-notice fights whenever the UFC needed him to step up. He had waited patiently during the entire Jon Jones saga, holding the interim title for over a year, while Jones received favorable treatment and ultimately retired without ever unifying the belts. Through all of that frustration and delay, Aspinall had remained completely professional and supportive of the organization. Now, when he desperately needed support and understanding, he felt completely abandoned by the people in charge. The UFC president hadn't called him once. The narrative emerging from White's public comments suggested that Aspinall had simply quit when things got tough. And the champion was apparently expected to stay quiet and accept this characterization of events. Aspinall chose not to stay quiet about any of it. He defended his decision not to continue the fight in his own words across multiple platforms. He appeared on various shows and interviews, including content for his own YouTube channel, where he actually shared footage from his hospital visits and medical appointments. He wanted fans to understand that he was not exaggerating or being dramatic about his condition. According to MMA Fighting, Aspinall stated, very bluntly, that he's not stupid. Why would he put his long-term health at serious risk when he couldn't see anything, especially because of a foul committed against him? He emphasized repeatedly that he was fighting an extremely skilled, world-class striker in Cyril Gane. Continuing without proper vision would have been completely reckless and irresponsible. Not brave or tough, it would have been absolutely stupid and potentially dangerous. The criticism from fans had wounded Aspinall very deeply on a personal level. He spoke about the unique cruelty of being blamed for a foul that was committed against him. In most other sports, the victim of a foul receives sympathy and support from fans and media. In mixed martial arts, apparently, the victim gets expected to continue competing regardless of the severity of their injury or face serious accusations of weakness and cowardice. Aspinall reflected on this troubling dynamic with a mixture of genuine disbelief and bitter resignation. He pointed out that if he had continued fighting and gotten knocked out, which was extremely likely given that he couldn't see properly, those same critics would have called him reckless and stupid. They would have said his ego was too big and he should have stopped when he got hurt. There was absolutely no winning with these people, he concluded. They were simply haters looking for any possible reason to tear down someone who had achieved success and recognition. The communication gap was particularly frustrating for Aspinall on a personal level. He revealed that White had not reached out to him personally, even once, since the fight occurred. While other UFC staff members had been in regular contact and offered access to medical specialists, the president himself had not made any effort to call or check on his condition. For a reigning heavyweight champion, arguably one of the most marketable and exciting fighters in the entire sport, this felt like a deliberate snub and sign of disrespect. The situation was extremely delicate from a business perspective. Aspinall was essentially criticizing his boss in public view. In the UFC, this type of public disagreement rarely ends well for the fighter involved. The promotion has historically wielded enormous power over its athletes, controlling everything from matchmaking to promotion to compensation. Some observers, including former champion Henry Cejudo, warned Aspinall against escalating the situation any further with White. Others felt that Aspinall was completely within his rights to speak up and defend himself against unfair characterizations. What made this particular situation somewhat unusual was that Aspinall wasn't demanding more money or a new contract with better terms. He wasn't trying to negotiate improved working conditions or special treatment. He simply wanted acknowledgement that his injury was completely real and that his decision to stop fighting was medically justified and reasonable. It was fundamentally a matter of respect and basic human decency, not business negotiations or financial disputes. The heavyweight division was now stuck in complete limbo. No realistic timeline existed for Aspinall's return to competition. The anticipated rematch with Gane couldn't be scheduled, and the champion and UFC president were engaged in a very public disagreement. For a division that was already starved of consistent activity after the chaotic Jon Jones era, This represented an absolute nightmare scenario for everyone involved. Throughout this difficult period, Aspinall also reflected on what the entire experience had taught him about fame, success, and public perception. He had been a genuinely beloved figure during his rise through the UFC ranks. Fans appreciated his devastating knockout power, his humble and respectful demeanor outside the cage, and his willingness to fight absolutely anyone the UFC put in front of him. The Jon Jones situation had actually made him even more sympathetic to casual fans. He was the young, hungry champion who got denied his chance at unification by an aging legend who refused to fight him. Now, all of that goodwill seemed to evaporate overnight after a single controversial incident. Aspinall observed that people will generally support you enthusiastically on your way up the ladder, but they become uncomfortable and resentful once you actually reach the top. Success inevitably breeds resentment and jealousy among certain types of people. Some fans, he believed, simply wanted to tear down successful people because it made them feel better about their own lives and circumstances. The IPO controversy had given those people the perfect opening, and they were exploiting it as ruthlessly as possible. Despite all the negativity and unfair criticism, Aspinall tried to maintain proper perspective about his situation and accomplishments. He reminded himself and his critics of everything he had achieved in his career. He held the UFC heavyweight championship. He held the record for the shortest average fight time in UFC heavyweight history. He had knocked out Curtis Blades in devastating fashion, completely demolished Sergey Pavlovich to win the interim title, and proved himself against every single challenger the UFC had put in front of him. Those genuine achievements and accomplishments could not be taken away by internet critics, with fake profiles and way too much free time on their hands. The tension between Dana White and Tom Aspinall didn't just appear out of nowhere. To really understand how massive this situation became, we need to look at the full year of frustration that preceded the UFC 3021 disaster. This relationship had been slowly deteriorating long before the IPO controversy ever occurred. Aspinall won the interim heavyweight title back in November 2023, but then waited over 18 months for a unification bout with Jon Jones. Jones returned from his injury layoff to defend against Stipe Miocic at UFC 309 in November 2024, then abruptly retired in June 2025. White's consistent reluctance to strip Jones fueled serious accusations of favoritism, with Aspinall publicly calling out the delay on multiple occasions. This wasn't a champion sitting around passively waiting for his opportunity to come to him. This was a fighter who repeatedly made himself available for any fight, who accepted matchups on short notice to prove his worth, who served as the backup fighter whenever the organization needed him. Yet the unification bout never materialized because Dana White protected Jon Jones at every single turn, prioritizing the legacy of one fighter over the career progression of another fighter who had earned his opportunity. On June 17, 2025, White finally issued Jones an ultimatum. He told Jim Rome that the UFC would resolve the entire saga within weeks, or they would move forward without the Jones versus Aspinall fight. The clock was finally ticking on a situation that had completely paralyzed the heavyweight division for far too long. Fans were genuinely excited at the prospect of finally getting some resolution to the mess. Just 4 days later, on June 20th, 2025, at the UFC Baku post-fight press conference, White announced Jones's retirement via a phone call conversation, officially upgrading Aspinall to undisputed champion status. White expressed regret about how everything played out, but promised to make it up to Aspinall financially. The implication was completely clear. Aspinall had been wronged by the organization's handling of the entire situation. By September 2025, Jon Jones himself acknowledged the damage he had caused to the division and other fighters. Jones admitted he was wrong in how the saga played out and actually sought a face-to-face apology meeting with White. White accepted the apology, but still barred Jones from attending the UFC's White House event, citing ongoing trust issues. White told Jones directly that the exclusion stemmed from him stretching their trust during the entire Aspinall drama. Even the greatest heavyweight in UFC history faced real consequences for creating scheduling disruptions and division-wide problems. The message from this situation was completely clear. Dana White valued reliability and consistency above absolutely everything else, and fighters who created complications would face serious consequences regardless of their status or accomplishments. If Jon Jones got punished for voluntary delays in scheduling games, what would happen to a champion whose serious injury kept the heavyweight division frozen indefinitely? The precedent was already established. The UFC 31 fallout created an absolutely impossible situation for the organization to navigate. Aspinall's first undisputed title defense ended abruptly after Gane's double eye poke caused severe orbital trauma and Brown syndrome. Aspinall prioritized protecting his vision over continuing to fight, which drew immediate fan backlash, and White's pointed public remarks. Multiple medical reports later confirmed just how severe the injury actually was. White's post-fight comments created a narrative that stuck to Aspinall's reputation like permanent stain. The phrase, "Tom didn't want to continue," became a weapon that critics and casual fans used to question the champion's mental toughness and heart. The damage to his public reputation was immediate and extremely severe. In a November 30th interview, White tried to address some of the backlash. He said that nobody should be faulting Aspinall for not being able to continue after getting poked in the eyes. He pushed for much stricter penalties for eye fouls, but confirmed that Aspinall versus Gane, too, remained the top priority as soon as possible, potentially in early 2026, once Aspinall received full medical clearance. But that commitment required a completely healthy champion who could actually compete at the highest level. The problem was that the champion had no realistic timeline for recovery. Potential surgery was looming over his entire situation. The heavyweight division sat completely paralyzed once again. This time, it wasn't because of Jon Jones's strategic delays and negotiations, but because of a serious injury sustained from an illegal foul inside an official UFC cage. Looking at the broader context reveals a really troubling pattern in how these situations develop. This echoes White's documented history of clashes with other top heavyweight fighters, raising serious questions about the UFC's overall fighter relations policies. Stipe Miocic felt consistently undervalued by the organization. Despite his numerous accomplishments and title defenses, Francis Ngannou departed entirely after major disputes over compensation and treatment by the promotion. Now Aspinall found himself at serious odds with the boss in ways that seemed potentially irreparable. Veteran referee Herb Dean confirmed that post-incident commission meetings have built significant momentum for much stricter eye poke guidelines going forward. Proposed changes include automatic point deductions for extended fingers and much stricter enforcement guidelines across all jurisdictions. But while these important discussions continued, Aspinall remained completely sidelined with no clear return date. On November 23, 2025, White harshly criticized Aspinall's threat to vacate the title if his friend Paddy Pimblett gets a title shot, calling the idea completely insane. The friction between champion and promoter was escalating with each passing week, with both sides digging deeper into their respective positions. By November 30th, Aspinall escalated his own rhetoric against critics, repeatedly emphasizing that illegal fouls don't require fighters to continue competing while essentially blind. The entire saga highlighted some serious UFC fighter relations issues. The organization is typically very quick to hype and promote stars like Aspinall when they're winning and generating excitement, but much slower to provide meaningful post-injury support when fighters need it most. This pattern echoes past controversies and could potentially pressure significant rule changes. But the immediate question remained unchanged. What would ultimately happen to the heavyweight championship? It's crucial to understand that the UFC, and therefore Dana White personally, retains the contractual authority to strip any champion of their belt in cases of prolonged inactivity or refusal to accept fights. This power has been exercised multiple times before. Conor McGregor got stripped of titles. George St. Pierre was stripped. Tony Ferguson lost his interim belt. The precedent existed and had been applied to some of the biggest names in the entire sport. With the heavyweight division completely paralyzed, with no timeline for Aspinall's return, with the champion publicly criticizing the organization and its president, the stage was set for an explosive decision that would rock the foundation of the sport. The question was no longer if Dana White would take drastic action, but when he would pull the trigger. The heavyweight division could not remain frozen indefinitely while the champion recovered from injuries that might require surgical intervention. As of late December 2025, Tom Aspinall remains completely sidelined with no official return date announced. The UFC heavyweight champion is not medically cleared to train or fight at any level. The surgery he mentioned, potentially affecting both eyes, looms ahead of him. His timeline for full recovery remains completely uncertain, and the heavyweight division hangs in limbo as a direct result of his situation. In mid-December, Aspinall responded to a training video posted by Cyril Gane. The Frenchman had uploaded footage of himself working out intensely, signaling his complete readiness to fight anyone at any time. Aspinall's response was extremely pointed and deeply personal. According to Bloody Elbow, Aspinall wrote that he's not medically cleared to fight and is about to undergo surgery, thanks to Gane's disgusting fingernails. He promised to return and smash Gane's face in as soon as possible. The animosity between Aspinall and Gane has intensified dramatically since the no-contest result. Before their fight, both men maintained a level of professional respect and courtesy toward each other. Now Aspinall has directly accused Gane of intentional fouling, which is an extremely serious allegation in combat sports. Gane, for his part, has continued training as if a rematch could happen at any moment, seemingly unbothered by Aspinall's accusations and threats. The rivalry has become deeply personal and bitter. When these two fighters eventually meet again, the stakes will extend far beyond just the heavyweight title. There will be genuine bad blood and animosity in that octagon. The question is when that meeting will actually occur. Recovery from bilateral traumatic Brown syndrome varies widely from case to case. The condition can sometimes resolve naturally with conservative treatment and time. Steroid injections may reduce inflammation and restore normal mobility. In other cases, surgical intervention is absolutely required, followed by many months of careful rehabilitation and recovery. Medical experts have noted that recovery timelines for similar traumatic eye conditions can range anywhere from several months to over a full year. Analysts at ESPN suggest that Aspinall could realistically return in mid to late 2026 at the earliest. This assumes his surgery goes perfectly and his vision issues resolve completely without complications. Any setbacks could push the timeline even further into the future. The heavyweight division now faces prolonged uncertainty that affects everyone in the weight class. Aspinall holds the undisputed title with no interim champion named. The top contenders below him, including Gane, Alexander Volkov, and others, are left waiting for clarity that may not come for many months. If Aspinall's recovery extends deep into 2026, the UFC may need to seriously consider creating an interim title to keep the division active and relevant. This would echo similar situations in other weight classes, where injured champions have been sidelined for extended periods. The welterweight and middleweight divisions have both successfully navigated similar challenges in recent years. For now, Dana White's update remains the official organizational position. The rematch with Gane will be rescheduled as soon as Aspinall is completely fit and cleared. The UFC claims they are prepared to wait as long as necessary, but how long they actually wait and what happens in the meantime depends entirely on Aspinall's medical recovery. Aspinall has emphasized throughout this entire ordeal that he will only return when he is 100% healthy and cleared. He is absolutely not willing to risk his long-term vision for any fight, no matter how big the stakes or financial incentives. After everything he has been through, the John Jones waiting period, the Gane eye poke, the intense public scrutiny, the friction with Dana White, the heavyweight champion is prioritizing his health and future quality of life over his immediate career concerns. This decision is entirely understandable and responsible. Athletes in combat sports face unique risks that most people never have to consider. The potential for permanent injury is always present in every single fight. Aspinall's eyes are not just tools of his professional trade. They are fundamental to his quality of life for the next several decades. Rushing back before he is fully healed could have consequences that extend far beyond anything that happens inside the octagon. When he does eventually return, the interest in his next fight will be absolutely enormous. The unfinished business with Gane demands a definitive conclusion. The MMA world wants to see these two heavyweight fighters settle their score definitively. Without fouls, without controversy, without any questions remaining, Aspinall will be determined to prove that he is, as he has said himself repeatedly, the legitimate heavyweight champion of the world. The story of Tom Aspinall and Dana White in late 2025 is ultimately a story about communication and perception. White's initial comments, delivered in the chaos and pressure of a post-fight press conference, landed very differently than he probably intended. Aspinall, dealing with a serious injury and facing unfair criticism from multiple directions, felt completely abandoned by the organization he had served loyally for years. Both men had valid perspectives on the situation, but those perspectives collided in very public view. What happens next will depend entirely on Aspinall's recovery and the UFC's patience with an inactive champion. If the champion returns to full form and defeats Gane decisively in their rematch, this entire period will become just a footnote in his career story. If complications arise and his return gets delayed much further, the heavyweight division may need to move forward without him, at least temporarily. For right now, the update from Dana White is clear and straightforward. The UFC believes in Tom Aspinall as their champion. They want him back healthy and competitive. They want the rematch with Gane to happen, and they are willing to wait for their heavyweight champion to heal completely before putting him back in harm's way. That represents the major update on this situation. That's where things currently stand, and that's the reality as we head into